My parents once told me my hands were good for tightening bolts, not building legacies. For years, a part of me actually believed them. I just never imagined they were a precious legacy would one day depend on a handful of those bolts at 35,000 feet. The question is, would saving their lives be a rescue or a reckoning? Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. My world has a smell. It's a mix of ozone, hydraulic fluid, and the faint, clean scent of stressed metal. Most people would hate it. To me, it smells like the truth. My name is Sloane Faulkner, and my office is a concrete-floored analysis bay where jet engines come to tell me how they died. I'm a lead aerospace engineer for a private defense contractor. My job is to find the breaking point in the most powerful machines on Earth. I listen to the echoes of steel. That afternoon, I was running my fingers along the edge of a fractured turbine blade, a beautiful piece of titanium alloy that had failed spectacularly during a stress test. I could see the microfractures, the shear patterns, the discoloration from the heat. It was a language only I and a handful of other people on the planet understood. This blade was telling me a story of pressure shortcuts and a single fatal flaw. It was my job to translate it. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. The caller ID showed my mother's name, Genevieve. I swiped to answer and put it on speaker, my eyes never leaving the turbine blade. Her voice, crisp and perpetually disappointed, cut through the air. Sloane, darling, are you in that facility? It's called the Lab Mom. And yes, I could almost hear her wince. Well, I hope you're wearing gloves. We have the final gala invitations for the Architectural Guild, and I need to know if you plan on showing up looking like you've been wrestling a car engine. Her words were meant to sound like a joke, but they landed like tiny, sharp stones. They always did. I told her I was busy, that the project timeline was tight. She sighed, a sound full of theatrical pity. Of course, it's always a project. Your father and I just don't understand why you choose to spend your life with things, grease and metal. We built a legacy of art of beauty that touches the sky. You just fix the things that fly through it. It's a different class of ambition, dear. I closed my eyes for a second. The insult wasn't just in what she said, but how she said it. Like my life's work, my passion was a regrettable hobby, a blue-collar stain on their pristine white marble world. I'll try to make it, I said, my voice flat. Don't strain yourself, she replied a little too brightly. We just need a final head count for the caterer. We'll see you at the airport tomorrow for the flight to Seattle. Try to wear something without a logo on it. She hung up. I stood there in the quiet hum of the workshop, the silence she left behind feeling louder than any engine. I looked down at my hands. There was, in fact, a streak of dark gray grease across my knuckles. I didn't wipe it off. I turned back to the broken blade on the table. It didn't judge me. It didn't condescend. It just presented the facts. In my world, the truth was made of steel. In theirs, it seemed it was made of anything they wanted it to be. The lawyer's office was the opposite of my workshop. There was no smell of metal or oil, only the faint, sterile scent of paper and expensive leather. The silence was thick, broken only by the quiet hum of the city 10 floors below. Arthur Vance, my family's lawyer for as long as I could remember, sat across from me behind a large mahogany desk. He was a man who was usually calm and collected, but today he couldn't quite meet my eyes. He kept adjusting a stack of perfectly aligned documents. He cleared his throat. Sloane, he began, your parents have asked me to formalize their intentions regarding the estate. He slid a folder across the polished surface of the desk. I opened it. The first document was a sales agreement. The property listed was the family ranch in Colorado, a place where I'd spent summers learning how to fix fences and change the oil in a pickup truck. It was the one piece of my family's world that felt real, a place that smelled like pine and dust, not perfume and ambition. The sale price was listed at the bottom, $8 million. I looked up at him, my throat suddenly tight. They're selling it! Arthur gave a slow, regretful nod. The deal is set to close next month. He paused, then pushed a second document toward me. And that brings us to this. It was an amendment to my father's will, a codicil. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was brutally clear. My name was being removed as a primary beneficiary. My share of the estate, including the proceeds from the ranch, was being redirected into a trust managed solely by my parents. I felt the air leave the room. It wasn't a shock, not really. It was just the final cold confirmation of what I'd known for years. I was not part of their legacy. The justification was written right there in black and white, a single, carefully crafted sentence that felt like a slap in the face. It stated I was being removed due to being fundamentally, quote, unsuited to the family's artistic and cultural vision. It was my mother's voice just laundered through legal jargon. I stared at the words, feeling a familiar, quiet anger settle in my chest. A cold, clean break. That's what this was. Arthur looked uncomfortable. He shuffled some papers, trying to fill the silence. On a separate note, he said almost as an aside, "Your parents' company, Faulkner Designs, is finalizing its first major acquisition as part of their expansion. A small aerospace parts supplier. You might know them. Aero Forge Components." The name barely registered. It felt like a random piece of static in a room that had suddenly gone completely silent. I just nodded, my mind still stuck on the cold finality of the document in front of me. I pushed the folder back across the desk. I understood. It was a fatal flaw hidden in plain sight, just like the ones I looked for every day. Only this one wasn't in a piece of metal. It was in my own family. I wasn't in that boardroom, of course. I would never have been invited. But I've spent my entire career reverse engineering failure, and that means I've learned how to reconstruct the moment a decision turns sour. I can almost see it. My father, Marcus Faulkner, standing at the head of a long glass table in one of the sanitized minimalist conference rooms he designed himself. He loves the aesthetic of power, clean lines, no distractions, just bottom lines. Across from him would have been the lead engineer from Aeroforge Components, a man probably in his late 50s, with lines of worry etched around his eyes. A man who, like me, understood the language of metal. Let's call him Peterson. On the projector screen behind my father, there would be a slide. Nothing flashy, just numbers. Profit margins, material costs, projected earnings for a new massive contract to supply turbine blades to a major commercial airline. This was my father's new playground. Not just building beautiful structures, but owning the small unseen parts that held the world together. I can hear Peterson's voice, steady but laced with concern. "Mr. Faulkner, he'd say the material specifications for this alloy are unorthodox. We're cutting the nickel and chromium content to a level that hasn't been fully stress tested for long-haul flight cycles. It saves 12% on costs, I understand that. But we're sacrificing thermal resistance. These blades will be more brittle." My father would have smiled. Not a warm smile, but the kind he used to close deals. A smile that was both a weapon and a shield. "Peterson," he would say, his tone smooth and patronizing. "You're a brilliant engineer, but you think like an engineer. You see problems, I see solutions. The client needs us to meet a price point. This alloy meets that price point. The simulations show it performs within acceptable parameters." "Acceptable is not optimal," Peterson would counter. "In aerospace, acceptable is the bare minimum. We should be aiming for redundant safety." "Redundancy is expensive," Marcus would reply, his smile tightening just a fraction. "This isn't a military jet that needs to survive a missile strike. It's a passenger plane. The contract requires us to meet FAA minimums, and this alloy does. Barely, but it does." He would then turn to the rest of the board, the executives he'd brought in to run his new acquisition. "Are we here to build museum pieces, or are we here to build a profitable business?" The room would be silent. No one challenges Marcus Faulkner when he frames things in terms of profit versus caution. He sees caution as a weakness, a failure of imagination. "I'm just advising that we run another 6 months of cycle testing," Peterson would say, making one last stand, just to be sure. My father would walk over to him, place a hand on his shoulder. A gesture that looked like camaraderie, but was really a dismissal. "And I appreciate your diligence. Truly. But we don't have 6 months. The contract is now. Sign the production order." And that would be it. The decision made. A quiet clinical choice in a room miles away from any real-world consequence. A choice that traded a few percentage points of safety for a few percentage points of profit. A choice made with a pen and a spreadsheet, sealed with a confident smile. A choice that put a tiny invisible flaw into thousands of turbine blades. A flaw that would sleep silent and patient inside the heart of an engine, waiting for the right amount of pressure to wake up. The first-class lounge at O'Hare was another world. It was a space designed to insulate you from the reality of travel, a quiet bubble of muted tones, soft carpets, and hushed whispers. To me, it felt like a pressure-sealed chamber, sanitized of any real character. I spotted my parents immediately. They weren't just sitting, they were holding court near the floor-to-ceiling windows, surrounded by a small circle of people I vaguely recognized from their holiday cards. They looked less like travelers and more like they were posing for a magazine they owned. My mother Genevieve saw me first. Her smile was bright practiced and didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sloane," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the lounge. "There you are. We were beginning to think you'd gotten lost in the duty-free section." The small group chuckled politely. I gave a tight nod and set my carry-on down. It was a simple, durable bag, a stark contrast to the designer leather luggage surrounding me. My father Marcus turned. He looked me up and down, his gaze lingering for a second on my practical, weather-resistant jacket. His own suit was impeccably tailored, not a single crease out of place. He looked like he'd been carved from marble. "Good you made it," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of my attendance. "I wore the jacket you like," I replied, a small, pointless attempt at peace. My mother's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "It's practical, dear. Very sensible." She turned to one of her friends, a woman dripping in delicate gold jewelry. "Sloane is our pragmatist. She has no time for frivolities." The woman glanced at my bare wrists and unadorned neck, then gave me a sympathetic little smile. It was the kind of look you give a stray dog, full of pity and a little bit of distaste. I felt like a spare part, a piece of functional but unpolished hardware, in a room full of decorative glass. I'd learned long ago that the best defense against their condescension was a blank wall, so I gave them nothing. Marcus clapped a hand on the shoulder of another man in a suit. "We just closed the Aeroforge acquisition this morning," he announced proudly. "A very good deal. It will look excellent on the portfolio." He said it while looking directly at me, a subtle reminder of the world he commanded, a world he believed I had no place in. The world where my entire field of expertise was just another line item on his balance sheet. I just nodded, saying nothing. There was nothing to say. When the boarding call came, my mother looped her arm through mine as we walked toward the gate. Her touch was light, possessive. "It will be good for you to come to this gala, Sloane," she whispered, as if sharing a secret. "It's important for you to see how your family contributes to the world of culture, to see what a real legacy looks like." Her words were meant to inspire me, I think, or maybe just to remind me of my place. All they did was make the air in the jet bridge feel heavy, charged. I had a feeling this flight was going to be a long one. I just didn't realize how much turbulence was waiting for us before we even left the ground. The plane had reached cruising altitude, that smooth, suspended moment where the world outside is nothing but blue and white, and the world inside is a gentle hum. I was trying to lose myself in a technical journal, a deep dive into new composite materials, but the atmosphere in the first-class cabin was anything but calm. My parents weren't just flying, they were performing. They knew a few other passengers, a mix of investors and art patrons, and the aisle had become a sort of impromptu social club. I kept my head down, hoping to remain invisible, but eventually the conversation drifted over to me. One of my father's associates, a man named Henderson with a loud tie and an even louder laugh, leaned across the aisle. "So, Marcus, this is the mysterious engineer daughter you keep hidden away," he boomed. "What is it you do again, young lady? Something with planes?" Before I could answer, my father stepped in, placing a proprietary hand on my shoulder. "Sloane works on the less glamorous side of things," he said with a dismissive wave. "She's one of those brilliant minds who takes things apart. A reverse architect, you might say." The group chuckled. It was a classic Marcus Faulkner move. A compliment wrapped around an insult designed to make him look magnanimous while subtly putting me in my place. My mother added her own flourish. It's terribly complicated, all those nuts and bolts. She sighed dramatically. We always hoped she'd use her talents to build something beautiful like her father. An art gallery, perhaps, or a concert hall. Instead, she chose wrenches. The word hung in the air. Wrenches. She said it like it was a dirty secret. The laughter this time was a little less polite, a little more pointed. Henderson leaned in again, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Well, every empire needs its mechanics, I suppose. Someone has to keep the engines running. My father clapped him on the back, enjoying the joke. Exactly. She's the head of our maintenance crew. He winked at me as if letting me in on the fun. And that was it. The trigger. The final public humiliation. In their world of polished surfaces and abstract concepts, I was reduced to a caricature. A greasy mechanic, a glorified plumber for their grand empire. They weren't just misunderstanding my life's work. They were willfully twisting it into something small and menial to make their own legacies seem grander. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the page of my journal, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. My hands resting on the armrest felt heavy and useless. The same hands that could diagnose a catastrophic failure from a single vibration were in their eyes only good for turning a wrench. The quiet hum of the engines suddenly felt different. It wasn't a sound of power anymore. It was a countdown, a low, steady vibration carrying us all toward a reckoning they couldn't see, but I was beginning to feel in my bones. It started subtly, so subtly that almost no one else noticed. It wasn't the sudden jolt of turbulence that makes your stomach drop. It was a vibration, a low, persistent tremor that felt less like air and more like metal. It was a discordant note in the otherwise smooth symphony of flight. While my parents and their friends continued their conversation laughing over another round of drinks, my entire body went on high alert. The feeling of personal humiliation, the sting of their words, it all evaporated. In its place, a cold clinical focus took over. This was the shift from Sloane the daughter to Sloane the engineer. My mind instinctively began to run diagnostics. I closed my eyes, tuning out the cabin noise, and focused solely on what the plane was telling me. The vibration wasn't consistent. It had a rhythm, a slight pulse that was just a fraction of a second off from the engine's normal cycle. It was the kind of thing a passenger would dismiss as part of the ride. But to me, it was a symptom. Then I heard it. Underneath the steady roar of the engines, there was another sound. A high-pitched, almost imperceptible noise. It wasn't a bang or a pop. It was a metallic whine, a sound I knew all too well from the test bay. It was the sound of metal under a specific kind of stress. Not the stress of normal operation, but the stress that comes right before a fracture. It was the sound of something getting ready to break. I opened my eyes and looked at the wall panel next to my seat, placing my palm flat against it. I could feel the vibration more clearly now, a faint high-frequency shudder that was definitely coming from the right side of the aircraft. My blood ran cold. Genevieve noticed my change in posture. "Sloane, are you feeling all right?" "You look pale," she said, her voice laced with that familiar patronizing concern. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. "I'm just listening." Listening to what the in-flight movie, she asked with a little laugh. I didn't answer her. My ears were still tuned to that faint metallic scream. The hurt and anger from moments ago were gone. They had been replaced by a much older, much more primal instinct. The instinct of an engineer who recognizes a fatal flaw. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't turbulence. This was the beginning of a failure sequence. The high-pitched whine lasted for another 10 seconds, then stopped. For a moment, a fragile sense of normalcy returned to the cabin. My mother gave me a look that said, "See, it was nothing." But I knew better. That sudden silence wasn't a good sign. It was a change in state. Something had shifted. Then the lights flickered, just once. A brief, almost imperceptible dip in power that made a few passengers look up from their screens. A moment later, a small muffled bang echoed from the right side of the plane. It wasn't loud enough to cause panic, more like a piece of heavy luggage shifting in the overhead bin. But I knew that sound. It was a pressure release. Something inside that engine had just given way. Across the aisle, Henderson, the man with the loud tie, nervously joked. Hope the pilot paid the electric bill. My father chuckled, but it was strained. Even he was starting to sense that something was wrong. The seatbelt sign chimed on sharp and insistent. A moment later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. It was calm, practiced, the kind of voice designed to soothe. Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to be experiencing a minor technical issue with our number 2 engine. We're running a diagnostic and will keep you updated. For now, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Minor technical issue. The words were a carefully chosen anesthetic meant to numb the passengers to the reality of the situation. But I knew what was happening. The vibration, the whine, the muffled bang, and now the captain's announcement. It was a classic failure sequence. Something inside the turbine had likely fractured. The engine was trying to compensate, but it was losing the battle. I leaned forward, trying to see out the window. From my angle, I could just make out the leading edge of the right engine nacelle. There was a faint, dark trail of smoke, almost invisible against the deep blue sky. It was thin, but it was there. They were leaking fluid. My brain was no longer processing emotion. It was processing data. The standard procedure for an engine issue like this was to shut it down, run the fire suppression system, and divert to the nearest suitable airport. It was a serious but manageable situation. But that initial metallic whine, it still bothered me. It didn't fit the profile of a standard component failure. It suggested something more aggressive, a cascading failure, an uncontained event. My mother finally seemed to notice the gravity in my expression. Sloane, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost. Worse, I said, my eyes still locked on the wisp of smoke outside. I think I'm hearing one. The plane gave a sudden violent lurch, this time hard enough to send drinks sloshing from their glasses. A few people gasped. The captain came back on the intercom, his voice a little less calm this time. Flight attendants, prepare for emergency procedures. That's when I knew. The standard playbook wasn't working. They were losing control, and we were running out of time. The captain's second announcement, the one using the words emergency procedures, was a switch flipping in my brain. It was the official confirmation that the situation had escalated beyond their control. The practiced calm was gone. This was no longer a malfunction. It was a crisis. I watched as a flight attendant, her face pale, but her movements professional, began walking briskly down the aisle, checking seatbelts and securing galley carts. My father grabbed my arm. "What's happening?" he demanded, his voice tight with an unfamiliar edge of fear. "They're losing the engine," I said, my focus entirely forward. I unbuckled my seatbelt. My mother gasped. "Sloane, what are you doing? Sit down. They told us to stay seated." I stood up, my body moving on pure instinct. "I'm not a passenger anymore," I said, looking down at them. "Not right now." I stepped into the aisle, intercepting the lead flight attendant. She was a woman in her 40s with calm, intelligent eyes, but I could see the stress behind them. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," she said, her voice firm. "I know this failure sequence," I said, keeping my own voice low and steady to avoid causing a panic. "The standard shutdown protocol isn't going to work. You have a cascading turbine fracture. You're not just losing thrust, you're risking an uncontained explosion." Her eyes widened slightly. She recognized that I wasn't a hysterical passenger. She saw the authority in my expression. "Who are you?" she asked. "Sloane Faulkner. I'm a lead aerospace engineer. My specialty is engine failure analysis. I've seen this exact failure mode in a test cell. I know what's coming next, and you have maybe 90 seconds to prevent it." For a moment, we just stood there, the chaos of the cabin swirling around us. Behind her, I could see my parents' shocked faces. In that instant, she had to make a choice: trust the scared passenger in the rulebook, or trust the calm expert standing in front of her. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I need to talk to the pilot, right now. I need to get into that cockpit." She hesitated for only a second. Then she gave a sharp, decisive nod. "Follow me," she said, and turned, leading the way toward the front of the plane. I didn't look back at my parents. There was no time. The plane was screaming, and I was the only one on board who understood what it was trying to say. The cockpit door clicked shut behind me, sealing us off from the rising panic in the cabin. The scene inside was controlled chaos. Alarms were blaring a symphony of urgent electronic warnings. Red and amber lights flashed across the control panel. The co-pilot, a young man who looked like he was barely 30, was pale and sweating, his hands tense on the yoke. The captain was barking commands into his headset, his voice strained. The flight attendant spoke quickly. "Captain, this is Sloane Faulkner. She's an aerospace engineer and expert in engine failure. She says she knows what's happening." The captain glanced over his shoulder at me. His eyes narrowed with a mix of disbelief and desperation. "This is a restricted flight deck, ma'am," he snapped. "Ding yet." I ignored the protocol. I leaned forward, pointing to a small secondary gauge on the panel that was fluctuating wildly. "Your EGT readings are off the charts, but your vibration sensors are lagging. That's not a standard flameout. The turbine isn't just failing, it's disintegrating. The standard procedure is to cut the fuel, but that will cause a thermal shock. The whole assembly could shear off the wing." The co-pilot looked at me, his eyes wide. He knew I was right. He'd seen the numbers, but he was following a checklist that didn't account for this specific catastrophic scenario. "What's your point?" the captain demanded, his attention divided between me and the failing aircraft. "My point is that you can't just kill the engine," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "You have to bleed the power gradually. You need to perform a non-standard fuel redirect. Reroute the auxiliary flow to bypass the primary combustion chamber. It will starve the fire without shocking the turbine casing." The captain stared at me. "That procedure isn't in any manual I've ever seen." No, I said. "I wrote the report on the test engine that did this exact thing 6 months ago." "It's not in the manual because it's not supposed to happen." Supposed. The plane shuddered violently, and a new high-pitched alarm began to scream. We were seconds away from a point of no return. The captain's training his entire career was screaming at him to follow the book. But the book was wrong. He looked from my face to the gauges, then to his co-pilot, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. He had seen enough. "Do it," the captain said, his voice grim. "Talk him through it." I didn't hesitate. I pointed to a series of switches. Auxiliary fuel pump to manual. Isolate the main fuel line. Now engage the crossfeed valve, but only halfway. You want to bleed it, not dump it. As the co-pilot's fingers flew across the console following my commands, I caught a glimpse of the cabin through the small window in the cockpit door. I saw my parents, their faces pressed against the glass, their expressions a mixture of terror and utter stunned disbelief. The daughter they had dismissed as a simple mechanic, the one who worked with wrenches and grease, was now in the cockpit of a failing airplane, speaking a language they couldn't understand, giving orders that were saving their lives. The irony was so thick, I could almost taste it. But there was no time for satisfaction. There was only the work. The next few minutes were the longest of my life. The aircraft felt like a wounded animal groaning and shuddering as we guided it down from the sky. The damaged engine was finally stable contained, but we were flying on borrowed time with only one fully functional engine. The captain was a true professional. Once he made the decision to trust me, he was all business coordinating with air traffic control, finding us the nearest airport with a runway long enough for an emergency landing. The co-pilot and I worked in tandem, monitoring the dozens of cascading system alerts, keeping the plane balanced and on a steady glide path. There was no more conversation, just the clipped, precise language of aviation. Altitude, airspeed, flap settings. We were a team bound together by a single desperate goal: to get the 240 souls on this plane back on the ground in one piece. The landing was rough. You could feel the immense weight of the aircraft fighting against the one good engine. The moment the wheels touched the tarmac, it was a brutal, jarring impact that sent a shockwave through the entire fuselage. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles were already racing alongside us, their lights flashing in the gray morning light. The captain wrestled the plane to a halt, the screech of tires and the roar of the reverse thrusters filling the air. And then silence. A profound, absolute silence that was more stunning than any alarm. The engines powered down. The frantic beeping of the alert ceased. For a single breathless moment, the only sound was the heavy breathing of the three of us in the cockpit. We were down. We were safe. That's when the sound from the cabin started. It wasn't screaming anymore. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated relief. Crying, cheering, and then applause. A thunderous, spontaneous roar of gratitude that washed over the entire plane. The captain slumped back in his seat, finally letting the tension drain from his face. He looked over at me, his eyes filled with a respect that was worlds away from his initial suspicion. "I don't know who you are, ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse, "but you just saved my airplane." I just gave a slow nod, my own adrenaline finally starting to recede. My hands were trembling slightly. The cockpit door opened, and the lead flight attendant looked in her face, streaked with tears. But she was smiling. As she began to coordinate the emergency evacuation, I stood back. My job was done. This was my vindication. Not in a courtroom, not in a boardroom, but right here in a cockpit filled with the sound of survivors. It was a victory measured not in dollars or prestige, but in heartbeats, 240 of them to be exact. The evacuation was a blur of organized chaos. I stayed out of the way, letting the trained crew do their jobs, my mind still processing the flood of telemetry data from the flight. Once the passengers were safely off, a team from the NTSB and the FAA arrived on the tarmac. The captain personally introduced me to the lead investigator, a no-nonsense man named Kenji Tanaka. He already knew my name. The airline had been in contact with my employer. They didn't treat me like a passenger. They treated me like a colleague. For the next hour, I was no longer Sloane the daughter or Sloane the mechanic. I was Sloane the expert. Tanaka and I stood under the massive wing of the crippled aircraft, the air thick with the smell of jet fuel and fire-retardant foam, and we talked shop. We reviewed the flight data recorder logs on a ruggedized laptop, and I walked him through the exact sequence of events I had observed. Then they brought it over. A ground crew member wearing heavy protective gloves carried a twisted piece of metal in a containment box. It was one of the few recoverable fragments from the shattered turbine. Even from a distance, I knew something was wrong. They placed it on a portable inspection table. Tanaka and I leaned in. The fracture was clean, almost crystalline. It was a brittle fracture, not the ductile tearing failure you'd expect from a standard alloy under these conditions. But it was the color that made my blood run cold. Along the edge of the break, there was a faint, almost imperceptible rainbow sheen, a telltale sign of metallic contamination and thermal stress failure. It was the exact signature of a cheap substandard alloy being pushed past its breaking point. Tanaka saw it too. He looked at me, his eyes sharp. "This isn't the alloy specified for this engine model," he said. "It's not even close." My heart was pounding in my chest, a slow, heavy drumbeat. My mind was racing, connecting dots I didn't even know existed a few hours ago. The acquisition, Aeroforge components. My father's casual dismissal of engineering standards in favor of profit. It all coalesced into a single horrifying conclusion. "I've seen this before," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "in a test report from a new supplier." Tanaka pulled out his tablet, his fingers flying across the screen, pulling up procurement records. And that's when I saw it. The name of the supplier who provided the faulty part. Aeroforge Components. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This wasn't a random accident. This wasn't a tragic, unavoidable failure. This was a choice made in a boardroom. A choice signed off on by my father. The contempt he had for my work, for the meticulous life-saving details of my profession, had manifested itself as a fatal flaw in a piece of metal, and it had almost killed us all. The next 2 hours felt like a lifetime compressed into minutes. Tanaka set up a makeshift command post in a quiet corner of the airport's operations center. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the low hum of computer servers. For me, it felt more familiar than any of my family's pristine living rooms. This was a place where facts mattered more than feelings. "I need the full metallurgical workup," I told Tanaka, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt deep inside. "And I need the complete serial number trace on that turbine blade. Not just the supplier, I need the purchase order, the date, everything." He nodded, already tapping on his laptop. He understood. We were no longer just investigating an accident. We were building a case. He granted me temporary access to the NTSB secure portal, and together we started digging. The full analysis report came back from the lab first. It was worse than I thought. The data was laid out in cold, hard columns of figures and chemical compositions. The chromium and nickel levels were dangerously low, replaced by a higher percentage of cheaper, heavier iron. It wasn't just a substandard alloy. It was a cheap, brittle knockoff designed to look right on a surface inspection but destined to fail under real-world stress. Then we ran the serial number. The digital paper trail was clean, efficient, and utterly damning. We traced the part from the engine manufacturer back to the distributor, and finally to the supplier. The name appeared on the screen just as I knew it would. Aeroforge Components. But it was the date on the procurement order that stole the air from my lungs. The order for that specific batch of turbine blades, the ones made with the fraudulent alloy, was placed 3 weeks after Faulkner Designs had finalized the acquisition. I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking patiently next to the date. There was no ambiguity, no room for excuses or plausible deniability. This wasn't a legacy issue my father had inherited. This was a decision he had made, a decision he had implemented. He hadn't just bought a company, he had actively poisoned its product line. He had traded the safety of hundreds of human beings for a few percentage points of profit. The cold anger I'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a hollow, sickening certainty. The contempt he had for my work, for the meticulous life-saving principles of safety I had dedicated my life to, wasn't just an attitude. It was a business model. And I was looking at the receipt. I found them in a private lounge the airline had cordoned off for the first-class passengers. It was a sterile, windowless room, but they had managed to recreate their own little bubble of superiority inside it. My father was on the phone, his voice sharp and commanding, likely speaking to his own team of lawyers. My mother was calmly sipping a bottle of water, looking more inconvenienced than traumatized. They saw me walk in, and a flicker of annoyance crossed my mother's face. "Sloane," she said, her voice a strained whisper, "this is hardly the time for a family discussion. We're trying to manage the fallout." "Fallout?" I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. That's an interesting choice of words. I walked over to the small table where they were sitting. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I just took the single sheet of paper from my jacket pocket and placed it on the table between them. It was the preliminary metallurgical report from the NTSB. I had highlighted 2 sections: the chemical composition of the failed turbine blade and the supplier name, Aeroforge Components. My father ended his call abruptly. He glanced down at the paper, then back up at me, his face a mask of practiced composure. "What is this?" "You know what it is," I said. "It's a receipt. It's the bill for your 12% cost savings." My mother picked up at the paper, her brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with us?" Everything I said, my gaze locked on my father. The arrogance in his eyes was gone. For the first time in my life, I saw something else there, a flicker of raw animal fear. He knew he was caught. He knew that I knew. "This alloy," I continued, my voice as cold and precise as the data on the page, "isn't just substandard, it's fraudulent. And the procurement order for it was signed 3 weeks after you bought the company. This didn't happen on someone else's watch. It happened on yours." Genevieve's hand went to her mouth, a silent, theatrical gasp. She looked at Marcus, her eyes wide with dawning horror, not for the passengers, but for the implications, for their name, for their legacy. The carefully constructed world they had built, a world of beautiful surfaces and profitable ventures, had just been shattered by an ugly, inconvenient truth. And the person holding the hammer wasn't a rival or a regulator. It was their own daughter, the mechanic, the one who knew exactly what the pieces meant. I didn't wait for their excuses. I didn't want to hear their justifications or their attempts to spin the narrative. I had the facts, and that was all I needed. I left them in that sterile room with the single sheet of paper that had just detonated their lives. I went straight back to Kenji Tanaka and the NTSB team. I handed him my full signed statement. It was a formal deposition detailing everything from the moment I noticed the vibration to the discovery of the fraudulent alloy. I didn't mention my personal relationship to the owners of Aeroforge. I didn't have to. I just laid out the timeline of the acquisition and the date of the procurement order. The facts were cold, impartial, and damning on their own. Tanaka read my statement, his expression unreadable. When he was done, he looked up at me. "You know what this means," he said. "This just went from an accident investigation to a federal criminal probe." "I know," I replied. The news broke less than 24 hours later. It started as a small story on an aviation industry news site, but it spread like wildfire. The initial headlines were cautious. NTSB investigates possible substandard parts in Skylink emergency landing. But as my official unredacted statement was leaked to a major news network, the narrative sharpened. By the next evening, it was the lead story. The name Faulkner was no longer associated with elegant architecture and philanthropic galas. It was now tied to words like corporate negligence, fraudulent materials, and public endangerment. A reporter stood in front of the Faulkner Designs headquarters in Chicago, the elegant minimalist building my father had designed himself, and spoke into the camera. The hero of Flight 712, aerospace engineer Sloane Faulkner, is now the key witness in a federal investigation that could implicate her own family. Sources say her expert testimony led investigators to Faulkner Designs' recently acquired subsidiary Aeroforge Components as the source of the faulty engine part that nearly brought down the plane. The story had everything: a hero, a villain, a high-stakes family drama playing out on a national stage. My parents' carefully curated world of prestige and influence came crashing down. Their company's stock plummeted. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. Their powerful friends suddenly stopped answering their calls. They had spent their entire lives building a legacy of beautiful surfaces of buildings that scraped the sky, but they had forgotten a fundamental rule of engineering, one that I had built my own life around. A structure is only as strong as its weakest component, and their foundation, built on a bedrock of greed and arrogance, had just crumbled into dust. The reckoning had begun. The days that followed were a storm of media attention and legal proceedings. My parents were officially named as persons of interest in the federal investigation. Faulkner Designs was hit with a barrage of class action lawsuits, not just from the passengers on the flight, but from every airline that had ever purchased parts from Aeroforge. Their empire wasn't just cracking, it was being systematically dismantled. I was hailed as a hero. News outlets wanted interviews, talk shows wanted me on their couches. The airline offered me a lifetime of free first-class flights. I turned it all down. I gave my testimony to the grand jury, answered every question from the FAA, and then I went back to my lab, back to the quiet world of metal and facts. People expected me to be triumphant. They wanted to see me celebrate the downfall of the family who had scorned me. But the truth was, I felt quiet. There was no joy in watching my parents' world burn. There was no satisfaction in their public humiliation. There was just a profound, hollow sense of emptiness. The victory I had won in the cockpit felt clean and absolute. It was a victory of skill over chaos, of life over death. This victory, the one playing out in the headlines and courtrooms, felt messy and tragic. It was the necessary, ugly consequence of a truth that had to be told. My father tried to call me once. I saw his name flash on my phone screen, and I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. What could he possibly say? I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is a hot, sharp emotion. What I felt was something colder, heavier. It was the weight of a final, irreversible disillusionment. The father I had always tried in some small way to win the approval of had been replaced by a stranger. A man who would trade 240 lives for a better quarterly report. I threw myself back into my work, finding a strange comfort in the familiar routines, analyzing fractures, running simulations, writing reports. In my world, actions had clear and predictable consequences. Metal behaved according to the laws of physics. There was an honesty to it, a reliability that I had never found in my own family. I wasn't celebrating a victory. I was mourning a loss. Not the loss of my parents or their fortune, but the loss of the idea that they could ever have been the people I once needed them to be. The reckoning was complete, but it had left a void in its wake. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a stack of official-looking envelopes from various legal firms. It was different. The envelope was plain, the address handwritten. It was postmarked from a small town in Colorado I hadn't thought about in years. My curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. The letter was from a man named Elias Vance, the longtime foreman of the family ranch, the one that was supposed to have been sold. I hadn't spoken to him since I was a teenager, but I remembered him clearly. A quiet, steady man with hands that were calloused from a lifetime of hard work. His letter was short and to the point. He wrote that he had heard about what happened with my parents and the airline. He wasn't writing to offer condolences or congratulations. He was writing to say thank you. The deal to sell the ranch, he explained, had collapsed in the wake of the scandal. The corporate buyer had pulled out, citing the reputational risk of being associated with the Faulkner name. Yeah. For most people, this would be bad news. But Elias saw it differently. He wrote about the other families who worked on the ranch, families who had been there for generations. They had been preparing to lose their homes, their jobs, their entire way of life. My actions, he wrote, had inadvertently saved them. The sale falling through meant they could stay. He ended the letter with a simple line that hit me harder than any headline or legal document. He wrote, "You might not think of yourself as a builder, Ms. Faulkner, but out here you just saved something real." I read the letter 3 times. Something real. The words echoed in the quiet emptiness I had been feeling for weeks. My parents had chased a legacy built on beautiful, hollow things. Buildings, reputations, stock prices. I had spent my life deconstructing things, finding the flaws that made them fail. I had never thought of myself as a builder. But Elias was right. By tearing down a corrupt system, I had accidentally protected a community. By exposing a lie, I had saved something true. A new thought began to form in my mind, a quiet but persistent idea that felt like the first glimmer of light after a long, dark storm. The ranch was still legally part of the estate, now tangled in a web of lawsuits and frozen assets. But it was still there, waiting. And for the first time since the plane landed, I felt something other than emptiness. I felt a flicker of purpose, a sense of a new direction. Maybe my legacy wasn't about taking things apart after all. Maybe it was about what I could choose to build from the pieces. The legal battle for the estate was long and ugly, but I had one advantage: my parents no longer did the truth. Armed with irrefutable evidence of their financial misconduct and negligence, my lawyers managed to untangle my portion of the inheritance from the wreckage of their company. It wasn't a windfall. After settling a portion of the passenger lawsuits and paying off legal fees, what was left was a fraction of the original Faulkner fortune. But it was enough. My parents, facing federal charges, had no choice but to relinquish control. I never spoke to them again. There was nothing left to say. My first act wasn't to buy a penthouse or a fancy car. It was to fly to Colorado. I took the recovered funds and made 2 strategic purchases. First, I secured the ranch, placing it into a new trust, managed by the people who actually work the land, ensuring it could never be sold off by corporate interests again. My second purchase was more pointed. I bought Aeroforge components out of bankruptcy for pennies on the dollar. The name was toxic, the reputation in ruins. Most people saw it as a worthless pile of debt and machinery. I saw it as a foundation. I walked into the deserted main hangar for the first time as its owner. The place was silent, coated in a thin layer of dust. It felt like a tomb, a monument to my father's greed. I stood there for a long time in the quiet and made a decision. I wouldn't erase the past. I would redeem it. 6 months later, the doors of that hangar opened again. The old sign was gone. In its place was a new one, simple and clean, with letters forged from polished steel. It read, Faulkner Labs. I didn't just reopen the facility. I rebuilt it from the ground up. I invested in the best testing equipment money could buy. I rehired the engineers my father had fired or ignored, including the man Peterson who had tried to warn him about the alloy. I made him my head of quality control. Our new company mission was printed on the wall of every workshop, a single uncompromising sentence: safety above all. Engineering with a conscience. But I went one step further. I used the remaining funds to establish the Faulkner Grant, a scholarship program dedicated to supporting engineering students from low-income backgrounds, with a focus on women and minorities. It was a direct rebuttal to the exclusive elitist world my parents had cherished. It was a statement that talent and integrity mattered more than pedigree. My legacy wouldn't be built of glass and steel towers. It would be built of people. People who like me understood that the most beautiful thing you can build is something that holds. It's been a year now. My days are long filled with the familiar smells of ozone and hot metal. I spend most of my time here at Faulkner Labs. My hands are usually smudged with grease by lunchtime, a detail that would still make my mother cringe. But the feeling is different now. It's not a mark of defiance. It's a badge of honor. It's the sign of a day spent building, not breaking. This morning, I was in the main workshop standing beside a young woman, the very first recipient of the Faulkner Grant. Her name is Maria. She's a brilliant, determined student from a small town in New Mexico. Together, we were watching a new turbine blade forged from a state-of-the-art super resilient alloy endure a stress test that was 5 times the industry standard. The engine screamed, the metal glowed, but it held. It held because it was designed with integrity. It held because it was built with a conscience. Maria looked at me, her eyes shining with an excitement I recognized in myself. "It's beautiful," she said almost in a whisper. I smiled, a real genuine smile. "Yes, it is," I replied. I looked down at my hands. These were the hands my parents had mocked, the hands they deemed unfit to manage a legacy. But they were wrong. These hands didn't just understand failure. They understood strength. They hadn't just saved 240 lives on a failing airplane. They were now building a new legacy, one forged not in the brittle arrogance of a boardroom, but in the resilient heart of a workshop. My father's legacy is a cautionary tale in business textbooks. My mother lives a quiet, secluded life, the glow of the spotlight long since faded. Their beautiful world was just a facade, and it shattered under the slightest pressure. My world is built of stronger stuff. It's built of honest work of second chances, and of the quiet, unwavering belief that doing the right thing is the only engineering that truly matters in the end. I am Sloane Faulkner, and this is my legacy. Not one I inherited, but one I forged myself. You know, the world is full of people who will try to tell you what your hands are for. They'll try to define your worth by their standards, by what looks good on paper, or sounds impressive at a party. But the deepest revenge isn't loud. It's the quiet, steady work of proving them wrong, not for them, but for you. It's about taking the very thing they mocked and turning it into your greatest source of strength. So I have to ask you, what's the wrench in your life? What's that skill or passion someone else looked down on? Let me know in the comments below. I read every one. And if this story resonated with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because the most powerful legacies are the ones we build for ourselves. Thanks for listening.